Major League All-Star Weekend or week or whatever we call it is wrapped up. All-Star game last night. The MLB Draft also took place in a somewhat more, I think, public fashion than I recall it in recent years. Nobody covers the Major League Draft and the rest of Major League Baseball like our next guest, senior baseball writer for The Athletic, Keith Law, kind enough to give us some time. Keith, I know that MLB cut the draft down from 40 rounds to 20 rounds several years ago here. In a prior lifetime, I was the Eau Claire Express beat writer for the Eau Claire Leader Telegram. And so there'd be some guy drafted in like the 39th round and like so calling and trying to get the assistant GM to tell me about something. I remember those days, but this is an absolutely endless process, especially when you're talking about, in some cases, these 17-year-old kids who are 8 years away from the major league. So bring this into the reality of, for people who care about the Major League Draft and their baseball teams, what did we see during that draft that's going to matter in the near term, maybe as soon as 2025?
Yeah, there's a perfect answer to that. Thank you for setting me up so well here. In that this was an extremely college-heavy draft. And that's because that's what the class was, right? The high school class this year was not great, but the college class was probably average or a little better than average. And teams, when there's uncertainty in the draft, teams like to go for the college players. They're closer to the majors. We have years of scouting looks. We have much better data available for the analysts. So there's just a greater degree of certainty anytime you're taking college players. And we set various records, including the first 8 picks were college players this year. That's never happened in the 60-year history of the 60-year history of the draft. I can do math. This was the latest we've ever gone before seeing the first high school guy taken. And I think it's a reflection of all the factors I just said. But from a fan's perspective, it's good in the sense that a lot of these guys will get to the majors faster. We saw it from last year. Paul Skenes, Wyatt Langford, Nolan Shaniel, Jake Bloss, all in the majors from last year's draft. I think this year's draft will be similar. If we have this conversation next July, there'll be a couple of guys already in the big leagues and a few more knocking on the door.
So tell me about the number one pick, Travis Bazana. I think I've got that pronunciation correctly. Number one to the Guardians. How soon do we see him, and why in that type of college-heavy draft is he the number one pick?
So the most interesting thing about him is that he's Australian, and we've never had an Australian go first overall. Typically, if we get Australians in baseball, they sign as teenagers, like players out of the Dominican Republic or Venezuela. But he chose to come to the United States to play at Oregon State for 3 years, and he raked. All he did was hit against some of the best pitching that an amateur can face in the world. And his performance, coupled with what everyone says is just an amazing work ethic, is why Cleveland made him the number one pick. He was actually second on my personal board behind Georgia outfielder Charlie Condon, but I understand why Cleveland would take Bazana, because there's a great deal of certainty around his bat. Everyone I spoke to said that's the best bet to hit. If you're looking at everybody in this draft class, who's the guy you believe, if nothing else, he will hit, and he will get to the majors and hit enough to be some kind of everyday player and maybe a star. I think that he'll do that, especially he'll hit the ground running. The moment they send him out probably to A-ball or AA later this summer, he's going to hit. He's going to hit in AAA. We'll see him in the majors at some point next year. And then who knows? We've seen a lot of very talented players struggle on first exposure to the majors. But I think the attitude now, especially with these college guys, is get them there faster. So, yeah, they might struggle right out of the chute like Wyatt Langford did. But now he's hitting much better because he's had a couple go-rounds. He's making adjustments. So the sooner you get him there, the sooner they make adjustments, the sooner they become valuable.
The other unique thing about the Major League Draft is you can be drafted multiple times, right? Historically, you can be drafted out of college, out of high school, you get drafted again coming out of JUCO, later on in your career, you can be drafted after your senior year. I didn't realize this until I saw a tweet from you right before the draft, but a guy named William Schmidt pulls his name out entirely 2 hours before the draft. I'm trying to put that in like the context of the NFL draft. Apparently, this is a fairly highly ranked player. Everybody scouts him. How does that take place? How do you get your name out of the draft, much less at literally the 11th hour?
He was a first-round talent. Now, first-round talents don't necessarily go in the first round in baseball. You can be drafted quite a bit later and maybe end up with first-round money, but not actually be selected in the first round. And what was really unusual about Schmidt's decision, because you can pull out, all you have to do is let Major League Baseball know, I do not want to be selected in the draft. And that's it. They'll just take your name out. It used to be much more convoluted, but they made it much simpler for players to say, I'm not interested. I'm going to college. And that part's fine. The part that I thought was unusual and probably not a great decision by his camp was doing it 2 hours before the draft. That really does not look good just from a personal perspective, right? There's a way you conduct yourself in what is essentially a business negotiation. Obviously, he and his advisors had been talking to teams. He must have gotten some sense he wasn't going to get the money he wanted. You don't go to the 11th hour like that and then take your name out. You do it a week, 2 weeks, a month before. We had a player pull his name out, I think, a month ago, and nobody even blinked. Yep, that's fine. He wants to go to school. Thanks for letting us know. But by this point, teams have spent so much time talking to him and his people, talking about him in draft rooms, and not talking about other players they may end up selecting. So his decision not to pull himself out till the very, very last minute just because he didn't get what he wanted really doesn't reflect well on him and ends up hurting other players. That to me is the big problem I have with this, where there's a way to pull yourself out of the draft. I don't think it's a great decision, but it's fine. That's what you want to do. You do that. But waiting this long, I think really disrespects the process and the scouts, the individuals who've spent so much time watching you, talking to you, evaluating you to maybe give you, in his case, he probably was going to get $3 million.
So last night, we have the Major League All-Star Game, and I think that if you were summarizing, for somebody who didn't watch any baseball the past 3 months, like what's going on in MLB right now? You had an Ohtani homer, you had a Paul Skenes start. That's really all you need to kind of define the first half of the baseball season, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's funny when they first talked about, well, should Skenes start the All-Star Game? I was like, I don't know. That's a little odd, right? He's only been in the majors about 20 minutes. And then they did it, and I saw the reaction. I said, yeah, I was wrong. He's one of the best stories in baseball this year. That's great. If he gets people to turn on the All-Star Game, if he gets people to watch more baseball, I'm here for that. Obviously, it's good for me from a business perspective, but as just a fan of the sport, right? He's amazing. What he's done, the fact that the guy was the number one pick a year ago and goes out and says, I need to add another pitch. Okay, sure. And he adds another pitch. And by the way, it's the best splitter in baseball this year, although he calls it a splinker. But that's amazing. Like, he is a great story. And if he's becoming must-see TV, that's fantastic for baseball as a whole, and obviously for the Pirates specifically.
The Ohtani effect, I think everybody's aware. He's been one of the brightest stars in baseball for a number of years now. Obviously makes the move this past offseason over to the Dodgers. I hadn't experienced it firsthand until last weekend. I was out here in L.A. and went to a couple of Dodgers games. And that's listen, L.A.'s got a little bit of a reputation for people not necessarily wanting to be in their seats, not necessarily arriving early. The amount of attention on every Ohtani at bat it's like you're watching, for me, for feeling it, from having been there, like Mark McGwire in 1998. Like, that's the type. You're not seeing the 700-foot home runs that later we'd find out were, maybe aided by various substances, but you're still seeing, you think that something major is going to happen. I ate sushi at a baseball game for the first time in my life. Like, there's an actual impact that has all these different tentacles that certainly for the Dodgers, they're going to make absolutely every dime that they're paying Ohtani over however many years back to themselves. But it also seems like him in that market on a team that is perennially as good as the Dodgers, it does seem like it's a thing that is a benefit to Major League Baseball as a whole.
I agree. He's his own economy, right? Remember when the Taylor Swift Eras Tour was kind of at its peak, people were talking about the huge economic impact that she would have on individual cities and what was the GDP produced by the Taylor Swift Tour. And I mean, obviously it feels ridiculous, but it's not wrong. There is a huge economic impact to, a concert tour of that size, or to Ohtani coming to your club, coming to your town. He absolutely changes the calculus for the Dodgers. Now there's paying a lot of money for that privilege also. So he's well compensated in addition, but it is a traveling road show, right? Where people are going to show up. I mean, when he was with the Angels last year and he came to the Phillies, obviously the Phillies draw well anyway, but I happened to go to one of those games just with some friends, and you could see the difference, the degree to which people were paying attention. These are Phillies fans. People are paying attention to his at-bats, seeing Ohtani jerseys. So you're seeing the opposite team's jerseys in the stands, which one does not typically do in Philadelphia if one values one's personal safety. But people were very into it and very excited to see him, and obviously very excited to see Phillies get him out a couple of times. But he is a phenomenon that he's great. I mean, obviously he's the likes of which we'd never seen, but he is absolutely great for the sport. I am a big fan of players who are outliers like that. And I was wrong on Ohtani. If you go back to what I originally wrote, I thought he was going to have a lot of trouble making consistent contact with the way he swung the bat in Japan. He made adjustments to become the player he is now. because he's a unicorn. He's a superstar. He is absolutely, 3 standard deviations above the mean, and that's awesome. We love players like that. They make the sport more exciting.
Is it strange at all to you that the gambling scandal that erupted around Ohtani back in spring training, it's not even a topic? It doesn't seem to come up. Baseball's had some of the biggest gambling scandals in all of sports going back over 100 years ago. And this has to be the nightmare for every major sport, for the NFL, for the NBA, which banned a player for life. Major League Baseball, this has to be at the forefront, especially because baseball players, let's be honest, they probably have more time on their hands than you do in a lot of other sports. There's a lot of time sitting around a clubhouse on your phone and maybe having an app you're not supposed to have. At a league level, or just from people within baseball that you talk to, not specifically on Ohtani, because now we have at least an explanation about the translator and there's been an indictment for the money stealing and all that, but is the idea of that being able to happen a concern for baseball as a whole, with the inevitability that somebody's probably going to slip up?
I mean, we saw a player get banned for life. Was that a month ago? Peter Marcano, who was a decent prospect. He's played a little bit in the big leagues. He won't be the last. I know a lot of people say, well, this is what happens when baseball gets in bed with all of these casinos and gambling entities. I don't think that's quite right. It's just that gambling is so pervasive now in the culture, right? It is very hard to follow any sport and not be inundated with gambling content, gambling advertising. It is just more accessible than ever. And obviously, for a lot of people, it becomes a legitimate problem. And there's quite a bit of research into kind of the neuroscience behind why people get addicted and why they just keep coming back, even when they know it's wrong, even when they know it can put their entire career at risk. So to me, it's much more about that than individual sports leagues cozying up to the gambling entities, which of course they're going to do. It's free money for them, essentially. Why would they not do so? And I don't know that there's an easy solution. I think baseball is going to have to hope that their relationships with these gambling entities continue to pay off where they get tips, because it's essentially what keeps happening is someone from the gambling side says, hey, we're seeing unusual activity, or we think this player is involved in something. That's generally how these guys are getting busted. And it's never going to be good for the sport. And Major League Baseball just has to keep trying to lean on the enforcement side, because I don't think there's any such thing as prevention.
The best education, in my opinion, for all athletes, every sport that they can possibly get. And if I were one of these leagues putting together the policies and whatnot, I would just hammer home. If you place a bet and your name is on it, if you download the app, if you register an account, the casinos are required by law to report it. Like, you are going to get busted. It is a 100% fail rate. You have to stay a million miles away from it. You were also covering the Futures game out there during the All-Star Week festivities. What, if anything, jumped out at you about that next generation, some of the guys we could hear from sooner than later?
There's a lot of good pitching out there. Now, I don't know how quick it'll get there, and obviously we hope these guys all stay healthy, but it was very dominated by pitching. There was a 19-year-old Noble Meyer from the Marlins. He was one of the best pitchers of the day. Noah Schultz, who's a 6'9" lefty with the White Sox. So he gets compared quite a bit to Randy Johnson, and it's not that ridiculous, actually. It is lower slot. He's up to 99. Slider is really tough to hit. That has got to be a very uncomfortable at bat for hitters, especially left-handed hitters. So there's quite a bit of talent coming. The hitters were a little overshadowed because a lot of these pitchers show up for, they're only going to work one inning. So just air it out. So we saw a lot of big velocities. But I was very happy to see Cam Collier, Reds prospect. If you remember Lou Collier, who played a little bit for the Pirates and I think the Expos, this is his son. Looks nothing like him. Cam is a big, strong kid with a lot of power. He hit one of the 2 homers of the day, ended up winning the MVP award, and I do think he's going to end up being an impact bat somewhere for the Reds in the next couple of years. So there's lots of talent coming. It's just the futures game is hard because there's just so much velocity out there right now. I feel bad for hitters trying to just get that one hit, that one at bat they get in the futures game.
So second half of the baseball season kicks off on Friday. In your mind, as we zoom out here beyond Ohtani, beyond Paul Skenes, what are the biggest storylines, especially over these next couple of weeks, even leading up to the trade deadline?
I think you've got a lot of teams that have stuff to do, especially approaching the trade deadline. And maybe if they don't do enough at the trade deadline, right? What does the second half look like for them? Yankees, Orioles, Atlanta, the Dodgers. I mean, these are teams that are all expecting to go to the playoffs. They probably will all end up in the playoffs, but I think all have flaws, all have things they absolutely need to address. And in some cases, it's more about getting healthy. You could argue the Dodgers are just waiting for guys to come back from injury, but can you wait for that? Or do you pass up opportunities to get better at the trade deadline. So I think it's going to be very, especially these next, 13 days from the trade deadline, going to be very interesting to see how active some of these clubs are. Do you rest on your laurels and say, we've got a huge lead in the division or the wild card race, especially in the NL where almost every team seems to be at 500? Or do you go after it? Do you go get aggressive and get, one of the 3 or 4 impact guys who are available in the market this year to try to get better, not just for the rest of the season, but to try to have more of an impact in October?
You can read him at The Athletic, one of the absolute best. Keith Law, thanks a lot for the time, man. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Catch the Rich Eisen Show every single day on the Roku channel, 12 to 3 Eastern, for free.